Alright, so today's video is a natty or not on Geoffrey Verity Schofield. And of course, this is a video that I wouldn't typically make. But after my response to Revival Fitness, as many good points as I think I brought up in a counter-argument to his video, I think there's a decent amount that I left on the table. And at the same time, I think there's kind of the whole elephant in the room of Revival calling out GVS for being a fake natty. So what I want to do in this video is prove to you, one, that GVS is actually natural in my opinion. And this isn't just about him. This is about deciding if someone's natty or not in general and having the right approach towards that decision. It can make a pretty big difference in what you think is possible and what you don't think is possible, and ultimately either let you go much farther in this game than you think you could, or stop you much earlier than you actually should be stopping. So it's an important topic to discuss, and GVS is the name that was brought up, and he happens to be the perfect example. So I figured I'd address the elephant in the room and talk about my perspective on this whole situation. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, where do you draw the line between skepticism and optimism? Of course, with natty or nots, these tend to be made from people that are skeptical and sometimes from people that are overall nihilistic. I am not nihilistic anymore. I'm definitely skeptical, but I think I have developed enough eye and I have enough experience in this industry to see who's natty and who's not. And I think it's very important that we don't just be overly skeptical to the point where it becomes nihilistic. So let me dive a little bit deeper onto that. When you enter the fitness industry, or when you enter bodybuilding or the community in general, you come in with optimism. You come in with a passion to get as big as you possibly can and develop your physique. Even if you don't want to get as big as you possibly can right off the bat, you want to develop your physique. That optimism quickly gets shut down from other people in a lot of cases. It happened to myself. This typically comes from lifters or content creators that haven't achieved an elite status naturally, and they blame factors outside of their control. These are people that constantly bring up things like genetics, or people that constantly bring up the incentives that fake natties have, and they point out how prevalent they can be in the community. I'm not denying that these people aren't a thing. It is absolutely a thing. But you can't let your skepticism of these specific fake natties override what you see as actually possible to achieve naturally. And I think in Revival's case, he's lost touch with his ability to detect who's natural and who's not. And the problem with this is he's a content creator with a decent sized following that is, when he says things like this, like GVS being a fake natty, and he's not even questioning it, he's saying it's set in stone and we should be laughing at him and mocking him, that's going to lead a lot of people that follow him and hear his opinions on that to believe that you can't get as big as GVS naturally. And I think that's an issue, because I'll talk more on this later when I get into the natty or not portion of this video, but GVS has an excellent physique. He does. He has a great physique, he has really high level arms, and overall he just looks great, so let's give him his props. We can't let the fact that there's fake natties that exist take away from what he's accomplished. And it's not just about GVS, because it's not like he's the biggest natty and he's this weird anomaly. Like, there's other guys that are just as big, many of them. There's a lot of guys that are bigger than him too. That's not a slight on GVS, it's just the reality of what you can achieve naturally, and he just happens to be another one of those higher level guys, and that's great. It's good that we have someone making this type of content that can teach people how to get past kind of that intermediate plateau and actually get to a bit more of an advanced stage in natural bodybuilding. So ultimately, it's good to be aware of fake natties. It's good to have a healthy amount of skepticism, and it's good to be aware of people that overly bring up genetics and things like that. It's good to be aware that genetics do play somewhat of a role. But you can't put too much stock into these overly skeptical, overly nihilistic people. There's a fine line, like I said, between skepticism and nihilism. So while it's good that these are things that you should be aware of, when you regularly defer to these cop-out critiques of other lifters more successful than yourself, you lose the ability to trust your own takes and trust your own opinions when deciding if someone's natural or not, and you let your skepticism override your optimism. So how do we avoid this from happening in lifters that are newer to the community? Well, obviously you can't let a healthy amount of skepticism become nihilism, and that's really where we have to kind of draw that line, because you can't just be an overly optimistic person and give everybody the benefit of the doubt. But how do you have some type of skepticism without letting that override everything? So it's good to have the ability to be skeptical. This can save you from false hope. If we just acted like everybody was natural and you could get as big as you possibly wanted to naturally, that's false hope, and that would drive a lot of people insane. That's where you get into situations like body dysmorphia, or blaming yourself for not working hard enough, or you just don't think you're good enough because you can't look like a IFBB pro naturally. Of course that's an issue, and that's an extreme example, but it's good to have somewhat of an idea of what's achievable naturally. However, it's a fine line between skepticism and outright nihilism. To me, someone who believes GVS is certainly a fake natty, which Revival does, I don't think those people have done their research. This is an example of nihilism, looking at something at first glance and making an emotionally based decision that the person isn't natural is nihilistic. If Revival had put in an honest effort into trying to assess the natural status of Geoffrey, objectively speaking, the answer you'll come up with is inconclusive skepticism at worst, and to believe he is natural at best. Compare him to the top natural bodybuilders. You'll see he has an excellent physique, but it's not like he's an outlier. There are lots of guys bigger than him. Just because someone sells something doesn't mean they're lying. It depends what they're selling and how they're selling it. So he goes on to say, GVS is selling coaching and selling ebooks, so he's a fake natural. And I think this is misapplied logic. And this was something he said in a comment, so he probably summed it up a little bit more brief than he should have. But we get into the situation where as soon as someone sells anything, there's a whole group of people that will just say, nope, fake natty, and they lose their ability to think for themselves. They just kind of defer to these little cop-out strategies, and I think that's an issue because now we're starting to write off what's possible naturally, and this is the exact problem I fell into, and I actually gave up on lifting for a few months a few years back because I thought I had hit my natural limit and I was constantly demoralized. Demoralization is one of the worst things that you can run into in life as an athlete, as a bodybuilder. It just takes away the joy of doing the entire process, and you think, what's the point of going on? You become nihilistic, and not only does this just hold you back in the gym, this mindset bleeds into everything else in life, and it's one of the fastest routes to depression. So when you run into people like this, you have to just understand that they're not always right, and you have to be able to think for yourself. And I would argue it's better to be overly optimistic than it is to be overly nihilistic. So when you run into GVS and you look at his page and you say, ugh, I don't know if I can do that because I haven't even shown any signs at all that I could even look that impressive. Is it a good idea to immediately think he's not natural and immediately think that's bigger than anybody could get naturally? I would argue no. I'd argue it's probably a good time to say, all right, well, I wonder if I can get that big naturally, and maybe you start listening to the advice from people that are roughly that size or that training age. At that point, after putting in your time and putting in your effort, then you have a better idea of if that's actually possible or not. I think a lot of these people just get stuck in that intermediate phase. Their lifting methods hold them back because they're overly simplistic, they're overly dogmatic, and they focus too much on the basics and they don't pay any attention to the finer details. And I absolutely understand the people out there that overthink and don't even work hard yet overthink all the small details. Those people exist, but again, that's not a reason for you not to actually think critically about your programming and try and learn more and become a better lifter over time. If you just think nothing matters and all you have to do is just train hard and eat, yeah, you're going to end up as an intermediate lifter. You'll make gains, but then to you, if you don't actually try and learn more and better yourself as a lifter, someone like GVS it becomes a fake natty in your mind, and that's an issue because he's natural. And there is more people that are coming into this opinion that don't think you can get big naturally, and it is pretty sad. So GVS, this is where we get into more of the natty or not debate. Is he too weak to be big? Is he too big to be this weak? This is the most common critique of GVS. How could he possibly be that big if he's so weak? Well, let's answer that question. 1. Leverages and resistance profiles cloud the correlation between size and strength on the power lifts, aka the big three. We learn that more and more over the years, with lengthened position evidence becoming more promising. So with the understanding that training in the lengthened position builds more muscle, you look at the power lifts and you look at the incentive that we have to put up the most muscle, or not put up the most muscle, put up the most weight possible. We're incentivized to shorten the range of motion and cut out the lengthened position. This has led to an abundance of people getting much stronger than they actually appear. I'm the perfect example of this, where I had a pretty impressive big three at a 1400 total at 182 pounds, and I was a kid. I was 20 years old when this happened. You look at the way that I was lifting, it wasn't going to produce hypertrophy because I wasn't even going through peak resistance on any lift. If you look at my joint angles, the only lift that got close to peak resistance was my squat, and that just hit peak resistance. I hit parallel. I didn't go below parallel in my squats because you don't have to go below parallel according to powerlifting standards. A sumo deadlift, you're training above what would typically be peak resistance. Same with a bench press. When your chest is up super high and the more you widen your grip, your elbows don't go very low. You're just not getting that much range of motion. And when you cut out what actually stimulates growth, you lead to people being stronger than they actually are, and people being stronger than they actually look. So when you use powerlifting in the big three 1 rep maxes or higher rep maxes, of course it depends on your technique, that's where you run into issues of the size that these people have is not, while it is correlated with their total in the big three and their overall powerlifting numbers, the size isn't what you should achieve based on that number if you're training properly for hypertrophy. And this has led people to be very high in the strength standards category, but very intermediate and average in the size category. So yes, there's absolutely a correlation between strength and size. The bigger you are, the more strength potential that is. Of course, this depends a little bit on how efficient you are on the lift and with your leverages, of course, too. But at the same time, you have to understand that people can milk strength out of a certain lift, especially one that doesn't have, that's based on range of motion standards that aren't based on the actual muscle, that are based on the lift itself. You have to understand that you can make strength gains much faster, because that much faster than you can make hypertrophy gains, because it's just simply not as stimulative. So during a lift that is very hypertrophically stimulative, of course, you'll make strength gains, but your hypertrophy gains will be much faster and much more accelerated. So that's one thing. The next one I have here is that strength versus powerlifting numbers. To me, it's clear that GVS is actually a strong lifter. Saying all big lifters are also strong, then referencing their powerlifting numbers is disingenuous, or it just shows that you don't actually understand what strength really is. To me, this shows a lazy approach where you're only using the most popular comparisons for size and strength correlation. But this doesn't mean a correlation doesn't exist in a specific case. If you look at GVS, his best developed muscle groups are the muscle groups that the big three don't train. So when you look at his physique in particular, I would say his quads are pretty impressive. Obviously, his arms and his forearms are very impressive too. His delts are insane. When you look at those muscle groups, they're not necessarily muscle groups that are going to be trained heavily and in a stimulative sense through the big three lifts. And when you look at what his strength numbers are at in hypertrophically oriented lifts, he's actually quite strong. When you look at something like his incline dumbbell curl, his overhead tricep extensions, even his quads, which he didn't grow through back squats, he mostly grew through machine variations. I know we talked about this in video when he had an injury, and he learned his quads actually grew better when he focused on other machines that bias the quads a bit more and get a little bit more bend at the knee. Those are the muscle groups that make his physique stand out so much, because the people that are so solely focused on the big three call everything else accessory work. And of course, what I just said is somewhat of a blanket statement, so don't take that too far. Of course, there are people that do a healthy amount of powerlifting and bodybuilding, and they have better physiques, and that's okay. Those people do exist, but it's not everybody. I would go as far as to say most powerlifters don't actually train their accessory work that hard. Not even close to as hard as someone like GVS or myself or NH or Alex Leonidas, any of us, would train our hypertrophy-oriented lifts. Notice that I call it just a lift for hypertrophy, and the powerlifters and power builders call it accessory work. I've trained powerlifters in the past. I've trained them for competitions. They do not train their quote-unquote accessory lifts hard, and that's why their physiques are lacking. These people do not mock bodybuilders when you're the same training age and you're training at the same intensity level and you're the same level of advancement. Bodybuilders are always going to be bigger, so you can't compare advanced, outlier, high-end powerlifters to low-end bodybuilders that are pretending to be bigger than they are on social media. So when you look at GVS, his actual strength numbers on the lifts of on the lifts that train his bigger muscle groups, they're actually quite strong. I don't know what they are exactly, but I think his curls are, I think, at least as strong as mine are, if not a little bit stronger. His tricep work is certainly stronger than mine. Yeah, his tricep work is definitely stronger than mine. I don't remember exactly what it is, but I know it's stronger. I don't know what he puts up for weight for his lifts for shoulders, but I, again, assume it's probably much higher than myself, and his shoulders are bigger than mine. His arms are also bigger than mine. If you look at the lifts that train the muscles that he has that are impressive, he's actually quite strong. So it does make sense. Again, of course, it's not a perfect size and strength correlation between every lifter, but he actually is pretty damn strong in the muscles that are impressive on his physique. Another thing, and this is what I kind of want to finish up on, so muscle growth mechanisms versus relying on what's been done throughout history. So this is a bit of an essay I've got here. Muscle grows through mechanical tension, not through progressive overload. And again, this is my training philosophy, which I think has a very logical explanation. Progressive overload on the big three has historically been correlated with muscle growth, but it has been misunderstood heavily. This isn't to say progressively overloading on the big three doesn't grow muscle. It's just not the most efficient way to go about it in most cases. Here's my take. The big three lifts that have been the most standardized and popular lifts throughout history for a variety of reasons that don't include optimizing hypertrophy, so things like accessibility, standardization, loading ability and potential, and even a delay in just designing and having access to modern equipment, to name a few examples. None of these things directly optimize hypertrophy. When you take these factors into consideration and create organizations that idolize these three lifts, of course people will get bigger using these lifts because all their focus and attention goes to these lifts. Anything outside of these lifts has been commonly referred to as accessory work, and to my knowledge, I'm the first one to speak out against this and call it out. What I'm trying to say is, it's obvious why these three lifts are put on a pedestal. They have a solid history of success, and then the other variables that I named, of course, that's why it's going to be these three lifts. History is absolutely valuable, but when you look at what objectively drives muscle growth, it becomes increasingly obvious that there's nothing special about these three lifts aside from the socially constructed pedestal we've put them on. So let me break that down a little bit for you. When it comes to the big three lifts, people act like, these are the lifts that everybody's used, they're the most progressively overloadable, therefore they're the best for hypertrophy. People have seen good progress because the competition, the competitive aspect, draws people to these lifts. That brings forward effort levels. If you can apply that same effort level to lifts that produce great amounts of mechanical tension, specifically in the lengthened position in a lot of cases, to every muscle group, your muscles will grow just as well as they would from these lifts. I'd also argue that when you get too hyper fixated on the competitive aspect of these 3 lifts, that's when you start to see people that are much stronger than their physique would show. When you start to do things like the big arch on your bench, setting the bar to a low bar on a squat and only going to parallel instead of beneath parallel, we run into issues that make these lifts less stimulative than they should be while accumulating more fatigue. You can make fun of the stimulus to fatigue ratio all you want, but once you become somewhat of an intermediate lifter, and this depends on your genetics, you have to specialize. The people that are hyper responders and respond very well to even a low amount of stimulus can get away with this kind of stuff. That's why you see some very high level people that just get away with kind of doing the basics. There's also a ton of people that don't make it that you don't see because they don't show up on your Instagram Explore page or your TikTok because they fail. And those are the people that need more specific training. And look at what GVS is doing. He built a pretty good physique from, I don't even know what he did. We can even say it was just the basics with a good variety of work. As soon as he switched to more focused work on arms, shoulders, quads, that's when he started to get these fake natty accusations. And the problem that we're running into is people are saying, oh, well, his powerlifting total, his strength isn't enough to be as big as he is, therefore he must be a fake natty. But if you look at what he does, he takes that competitive drive and he takes that effort level and he applies them to these other lifts, and guess what? He grows. And that's why I said he's the perfect example to make my case today. Muscles grow through mechanical tension. They don't grow through progressive overload causing growth on the heaviest, biggest lifts in the gym. Of course, some lifts are going to be heavy because some muscle groups can handle a lot of weight, and that's fine, but that's besides the point. When you look at something like an incline dumbbell curl or a cable overhead tricep extension, people call that accessory work and they don't apply the same effort that they do to the big 3. GVS completely changed that in his own physique. He put all the eggs in those baskets of developing his arms, developing his shoulders, his quads, etc., and it shows in his physique. So what does this show? Your size isn't correlated necessarily with your powerlifting total. It's more correlated with your strength in that specific muscle. So with that being said, I think that's all the points that I got. So if you guys have any other questions or anything else you want to point out about this entire topic, please let me know. I'm pretty sure that's it. I think I got it all off my chest. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will see you guys in the next one.